to look a little bit at how the users and roles are set up in Rillion Prime and what you need to think about when creating your users and roles. So in Rillion Prime, all of your users that work at your company, they must have a user profile in Rillion Prime, and that user profile must be connected to at least one role in order for them to be able to log in. So here on the left-hand side, we have a user profile, and the user profile contains information such as the name of the person, the user ID, and email address. Nowadays, it's quite common to have single sign-on set up in your Rillion Prime environment. And if you do have that or you want to have it set up, then it's very important to remember that the user ID should be the same as what you have in your, for instance, Microsoft Entra ID. So those two details must be the same in order for the single sign-on to work. Then the user profile is, as I mentioned, connected to at least one role. And on the role, we are setting up the permissions for what the role or the person working with that specific role in Rillion Prime should be able to do and see in the system. So on the role, we have something called permission groups. And the permission groups are a function in the system where we are able to, on a very detailed level, limit permissions for different types of users and roles in the system. So for instance, those who are working as reviewers of invoices, they need to have a specific level of permission. And those who work as approvers of invoices or system administrators or accounts payable type of roles, they need to have their own level of permissions. So we are able to achieve that with the help of the permission groups, and those are set up on the role. On the role, we also have the role permissions to the accounts and the companies and all the accounting dimensions that you have. So if you have several companies in your Rillion Prime environment, and for instance, a specific role is only working with one of the companies, then it would make sense to limit the permissions on the company at least. So they would only be able to work with and see invoices for that specific company. And on the role, depending on if the role is working as a reviewer or as an approver in the system, you also need to have authorization amounts if you want to have set authorization amounts on the role level. So let's say you have an approver level role that needs to be able to approve invoices up to a specific amount, then you would add that specific amount to the role. And for users who are only working as system administrators or, for instance, then reviewers of invoices, they will not be needing an authorization amount. So that is only then necessary for those who work as approvers. And regarding the whole role setup in Rillion Prime, as I mentioned at the beginning, every user must be connected to at least one role. And this also means that every user can have more than one role if needed. And it also means that one role can have several users, so it can be a shared role. For instance, the accounts payable role is very often a role shared by everyone working within the team. And when you are setting up the users and the roles, it is important to have a think about how you name the roles. So our recommendation in terms of best practice for role naming is that the name of the role or the role ID should be something that would sort of give away a little bit regarding what type of function the role performs within the company. So in this example here, you can see that we have a CFO role. It could be a marketing manager or engineering something similar, but the role ID or role name describes what function the role performs within the company. And the reason for why we consider this to be best practice is that it will allow you to have to do a little bit less administration whenever people join or leave the company. So you don't necessarily then have to always deactivate roles and create new ones, but rather you can just swap out the users of the roles and the role can continue existing as it was. And now we're going to change the screen and I'm going to show you what the user profile and the role looks like in the environment. So now we're inside the Rillion Prime environment. And on this page here, we can see that I am now logged in as an accounts payable level role. And if I go here into administration, then I will be able to find the users and the roles here under general information. So let's have a look at the user first. And let's have a look here at my own user profile that I'm using right now. In this field here for user, we have the value that is the user ID. And this is the value that should be the same as, for example, your Entra ID if you are using single sign-on. These fields, the name and the email, those can be edited afterwards as well. But as you can see here, the user ID is grayed out, which means that when you have created a user profile and started working in the system, you're not able to edit this afterwards. So this is something that, for instance, should a person perhaps change their name, then you would need to create a new user profile for them because this cannot be edited afterwards. But the name and the email address, they can be edited, as you can see. And then you are able to choose a language for the user profile. And this is something that the users will have access to as well on their own Rillion Prime page. So they are able to access their own user profile and they can change the language. For instance, we have most of the Nordic languages, a few European ones, and of course English here that you can choose between. Then you're also able to choose what type of homepage you want to see. And this refers to the first page that you see when you're logging into the system. So when we started this demonstration, what you saw there was the invoice inbox for the specific role that I am logged in as right now. Sometimes you can also have something here called dashboard, and that is something that is a bit like a notice board. You can see a breakdown of your activities that you have to do. And then it would be a breakdown of perhaps invoices that you have to handle, contracts that you have to sign, and so on. And then let's jump down here to layout, which is also something that some of the users might want to change. So we have two options here under layout, and they're called responsive and classic. And the only place where you can really see that this impacts is when you are handling your invoices in your invoice inbox. Then depending on if you're using the responsive layout or the classic layout, it will display the invoice image in a slightly different manner. So if you're using the responsive layout, then you will see the invoice image on the left-hand side of your screen, and then the rest of the parts that are related to the invoice handling are more on the right-hand side of the screen. And then if you're using the classic layout, then you have the invoice image at the middle of the page or at the top. And you will most often, depending on the size of your screen, you will see half of the invoice image, and then the rest of the parts related to the invoice handling will be aligned alongside on the left-hand side and underneath the invoice image. Those are the parts that are the ones that the users most often might want to change after the environment has been set up, or when you are then setting it up.
What do you normally recommend, Henrika, for like a layout here, responsive or classic? What is your recommendation normally? Or is it very personal preference, or what would you recommend?
I have a strong personal preference for the responsive layout because I like to be able to see the invoice image so that I can see the full invoice image on the left-hand side. But it is indeed a very personal preference, and someone else might like to use the classic layout instead and have perhaps more of the other parts of the invoice handling visible in that way. So I would recommend just trying it out and see which one you prefer. But my preference is definitely the responsive layout because then I can see more of the invoice image at the same time.
Great.
And in terms of the home page, if we think about that in the same way, what my preference would be there, I think my personal preference for that would be to have dashboard as my homepage, because if the company using Rillion Prime is using the dashboard as a bulletin board to inform their users of the system of things going on in the system, or let's say that you're coming close to closing of a period perhaps, and you want to inform all of your users that they should be handling their invoices, then if I use the dashboard as my homepage, then I would be able to see those information messages that have been posted on the bulletin board as soon as I log in. But again, this is very much a personal preference, and someone else might want to have their invoice inbox as their landing page or home page when they log in, because then they have direct access into their invoices. Now let's move on to the roles. We have to go a little bit further down than where we saw the role, the user. So let's click here on role. Now, because I'm not going to be looking for a specific role, I'm not going to limit my search. I'm just going to hit search here and we'll get the complete list of all the roles that exist in this environment. Here already at a first glance, we can see which of these roles are working as approvers of invoices, just based on which roles have an authorization amount here. So let's go into the CEO role. So here we can see that the role, so the role ID and the name of the role, they are here, but the exact same ones. And this role field, or the role ID, that is the field where we recommend that the role ID is something that tells everyone working in the system what kind of function this role is performing within the company. This name field, that could be the same as the role ID here in this example, but it could be also be perhaps the person's name if you prefer. Then you have a way of identifying here just by looking at the role who the person is who is working with this role. But then this, of course, is an option only when you have a role then that is used by only one user, one person. And if you have a shared role, then of course it wouldn't make sense to have the name of one person here. When you are setting up new roles, there are a few very important things to think about. First of all, if the role is a role that should be handling invoices, then you need to make sure that the role is active. So of course that it can be used. It also needs to be a role that can be inserted into flows. So flows of for invoices or contracts or whatever else type of documents you're handling. So those are important. And then if you want to have one set authorization amount for the role, then you would add it here in this field. And now let's go and look at the details we have here on the right-hand side. We have the permission groups here. And the permission groups, they exist in the administration module. We're not going to look at them in more detail just now, but we'll come back to them at a later stage. But here you can see that there is a long list of different types of permission groups. And here for this role, we have chosen which permission groups this role should have access to. If you want to see the total level of permissions that this role has, so all of these permission groups combined, you're able to see that here if you go into permissions and operation permission. So every permission group has certain settings, and when you combine all of these, the system will combine it, so you will get the highest level on each setting then, depending on how these are set up, these permission groups. But we'll come back more to the permission groups at a later stage. So now we're just going to focus on the permissions for companies, accounts, dimensions, etc. So here, if we go into select permissions, you can see here that there are some limitations down here. So we have access to all the companies. Then there are some limitations in terms of accounts. Then we have some objects here or dimensions, a cost center, project, and then we have the item type and expense type that are not related to the invoice module. So they're related to the buyer and the expense module. This is where you would limit then the permission. So if you want to limit the permission based on company, or if you only want to give the role access to certain accounts or certain cost centers or some other dimensions that you're working with, you would be able to do that here. Here you can see which of the users are connected to this specific role. This is where you would connect the users to the role, so you can see who is actually using this. Settings, for instance, for reminders, how often the role should get notified about new invoices or contracts or something else that they have received in the invoice. And they would be then sent out by the system based on the settings that you have here. And let's go and have a look. We could see, for instance, the accounts payable role. So here you can see an accounts payable role that is also active, and it can be inserted into flows. But because it is not used for approving invoices, it doesn't have an authorization amount, and it has slightly different permission groups here than the previous role that we were looking at. And if we go and look into the permissions here, we can see that for this role, it has only a limitation on the company, but the rest of it is they have access to all the accounts and the objects related to that specific company. If you ever do want to see all of your roles, how you name them, what kind of setup you have, you're able to take all of that data out into an Excel file and view it there. And this is something that could sometimes be helpful, for instance, when you have an audit going on and they might be asking about the roles and how they are set up. Then you can extract that information here. And those were the most important parts or things to think about when creating new roles and users.